Here it is, right here. This is the moment millions of Americans lost leverage they never realized they were holding. When President Trump announced a 10% tariff on Canadian energy, the assumption was simple: squeeze Canada, raise revenue, force concessions. But that's not what happened. Almost immediately, Quebec's premier stepped in front of cameras and said something far more consequential. He wasn't threatening retaliation. He said Quebec was exploring legal options to exit long-term electricity contracts with UK states, specifically Massachusetts and New York, contracts worth billions, infrastructure Americans spent over a decade building, potentially rendered useless overnight. Let me show you why that matters. Massachusetts just completed a massive energy project that took 10 years to push through courts, regulators, environmental challenges, and statewide referendums. The New England Clean Energy Connect finally went live in January 2026. 145 miles of high-voltage transmission line designed for a single purpose, bringing Canadian hydroelectric power directly into the New England grid. State officials celebrated. The governor called it a turning point. Clean energy, stable pricing, lower household bills. The plan was to supply roughly 20% of Massachusetts' electricity through this line. Then the tariffs hit. Within days, Hydro-Quebec stopped selling electricity into the regional spot market. 2 days later, the brand new transmission line went quiet. Power flow dropped to zero for more than a week. Hydro-Quebec blamed weather. Warmer temperatures made exports less profitable, they said. Technically plausible, politically impossible to ignore, because almost simultaneously, Quebec's premier went on television and confirmed what everyone was already thinking. The province was examining whether it could legally walk away from the new contracts altogether, not issuing threats, studying options. And that's the key difference. Massachusetts spent 10 years and billions of dollars building infrastructure that only works if Quebec wants to keep selling electricity. 20-year contracts, guaranteed savings of roughly $50 million a year for ratepayers, a central pillar of the state's climate strategy. Then Washington launched a trade fight with the supplier, and Massachusetts isn't alone. New York is in an even more exposed position. The Champlain-Hudson Power Express, a 339-mile underwater cable running from Quebec to New York City, is nearing completion. A $6 billion project designed to power roughly 1 million homes in the city starting mid-26. Another 20-year contract. Fixed pricing. Round-the-clock clean electricity. The backbone of New York's climate plan. All of it now sits under a cloud created by tariffs that didn't consider how electricity actually works. And that's where this becomes catastrophic. This isn't really about whether Quebec will cut power tomorrow. It's about what Trump accidentally revealed to everyone watching. New England is structurally dependent on Canadian electricity, and Quebec has options the U.S. states simply do not. That dependency didn't appear overnight. For more than 40 years, New England has relied on Quebec hydroelectric power. The relationship dates back to the 1980s, when massive transmission infrastructure was built specifically to move electricity from James Bay into the northeastern United States. It worked because both sides benefited. Quebec had enormous surplus capacity from its dams. New England faced high fossil fuel costs and climate targets it couldn't meet domestically. Vermont is the most extreme example. Roughly a quarter of its electricity comes from a single Hydro-Quebec contract, running through 2038. That deal has kept rates stable, while neighboring states saw price spikes of 20 to 40%. Nearly 40% of Vermont's imported electricity comes from Canada. New York imported nearly 8 terawatt-hours from Quebec and Ontario last year. That's not emergency backup power. That's a core structural input, and Trump walked straight into it. He looked at Canadian energy and assumed leverage flowed one way: charge more, collect tariffs, force compliance. But electricity isn't oil. You can't load it onto tankers and reroute it halfway across the globe. Electricity moves through wires between interconnected grids. Quebec controls the dams. Quebec controls the reservoirs. Quebec can hold water when prices are low and release it when prices spike. New England doesn't have that flexibility. More than 60% of its generation comes from natural gas. During winter freezes and summer heat waves, gas prices explode because the same pipelines serve home heating and power plants simultaneously. Wholesale electricity prices can multiply overnight. Canadian hydro smooths those spikes. When prices surge, Quebec sells more power south, pushing costs back down. Consumers never see the worst of it. Remove that stabilizer, and New England faces ugly choices. Build more gas plants, expensive and politically toxic. Deploy grid-scale batteries at a size that still isn't commercially viable. Or do what Massachusetts and New York chose. Lock in long-term Canadian hydro through dedicated transmission lines. Billions spent, infrastructure tailored to one supplier, entire energy strategies built around that assumption. And then tariffs shattered the illusion of stability. Here's the part that kept me awake. The Clean Energy Connect contract alone guarantees roughly 1,200 megawatts, nearly 10 terawatt-hours annually, from Quebec Hydro. The Champlain-Hudson line adds another massive tranche of fixed supply. Combined infrastructure investment exceeds $10 billion, money already spent, lines already built, converter stations already operating. All of it only works if Quebec chooses to keep exporting. And even if Quebec can't legally cancel contracts outright, it doesn't need to. Minimum delivery clauses don't cap behavior. Quebec can meet bare requirements while refusing to sell a single additional megawatt during peak demand, exactly when New England needs it most. Hydro-Quebec's leadership hasn't hidden their position. They've openly described the tariffs as bullying. They've stated they're prepared to match tariffs rate for rate through surcharges and pricing adjustments. The message was unmistakable. Leverage exists, and Quebec now knows it. Ontario tried something similar and failed. When Ontario's premier threatened export surcharges last year, Washington responded immediately with escalation threats. Ontario backed down within a day. Quebec didn't, because Quebec isn't bluffing. Hydro-Quebec doesn't need US markets the way Alberta needs oil pipelines. Electricity gives Quebec flexibility. Power can be sold domestically, redirected to Ontario, stored as water, or withheld until prices improve. The dependency runs one direction, and Trump made it visible. Even worse, the immediate crisis didn't have to explode to do lasting damage. Tariffs were partially paused, contracts remain intact, power is flowing again, but trust is gone. Quebec's leadership has said openly that the United States can no longer be treated as a predictable partner. That's not rhetoric, that's strategic recalculation. Future projects will be smaller, contracts more flexible, commitments hedged, infrastructure designed to preserve optionality, which leaves Massachusetts and New York stuck. They've already spent the money, they can't pivot suppliers. Canadian hydro is the only large-scale clean baseload option within transmission distance. Building alternatives would take decades and cost far more than what's already been sunk. Trump didn't extract leverage, he transferred it. And the political fallout won't land in Washington. It will land on ratepayers when bills rise, on businesses when grid reliability tightens, on climate policy when emissions increase because gas plants run longer. This wasn't about electricity alone. It was about turning infrastructure into a weapon. When long-term cooperation becomes hostage to short-term trade fights, nobody builds anything that depends on trust. Pipelines, transmission corridors, water agreements, cross-border systems all become liabilities. And that's the most dangerous signal this sent. If the US will destabilize energy infrastructure with its closest ally, why would anyone assume American commitments last 20 years? Trump talks about energy dominance. What he demonstrated instead was political volatility. The lights are still on for now, but everyone involved now understands how fragile that assumption is. Quebec knows it holds leverage. New England knows it has exposure. That shadow will hang over every negotiation going forward. So when people ask how this happened, the answer is simple. Someone treated electricity like oil, infrastructure like a bargaining chip, and cooperation like weakness. And now millions of Americans will spend decades paying for a vulnerability that never needed to exist. So I'll ask the same question I keep coming back to. What am I missing?